All right, welcome everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So, my name is Emily Hall, coming to you from Glover Nursery out in West Jordan, Utah. I have a couple different horticulture degrees, and one of them is about urban agriculture production. And I've worked at a couple farms, grew up growing tomatoes and all sorts varieties of vegetables. So that's why I'm here talking to you today. So today our main topic is going to be all about tomatoes, but please feel free if there is any questions that you have about something going on in your spring garden right now. We also are definitely open and loving to discuss any and all of that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I have a short little presentation with some slides, so I will be hopping back and forth between the presentation and the live to see if you have any questions. But please feel free, drop those questions in the chat, and we'll definitely have some time at the end also if there's anything that we have missed. All right, so today it's all about tomatoes. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is our climate here in Utah. So we actually kind of have a big difference between what all varieties are in Utah, which is pretty interesting. We've got several different climates, regions, and then microclimates in between that. So it can be it can be a little more tricky to kind of figure out if exactly what's going on where you live, but there definitely is some resources to help us get there. So for the most part over Utah, our hardiness zones span from 4 to 8. I believe here in West Jordan that we're 7A. So that is something that does play a role with our tomatoes. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is when you look at our last frost date and our first frost date in spring and fall, it is a little bit of a shorter growing season than some other climates have. And why that is important is for tomatoes, they have a little bit longer of a time for maturity. And a lot of what is seen, like on your seed packets, they have those dates of 68 days to maturity. And that is actually after you transplant it. So that's just kind of something else to keep in mind. And with tomatoes, they are a warm climate plant. So we have to, if you plant it too soon, then you run into the dangers of having frost, damaging your plants. So that's kind of why it's important to keep those dates in mind. And I feel like sometimes, I don't know, tomatoes are really fun because I feel like some people look at it as a challenge of how fast can I get my tomatoes going? How big can I get my tomatoes in that time? So I think it's like a fun little game that we can all really play and get better at. So, okay, so now we're going to talk about different types of tomatoes. And that is important when you're thinking about what you want to plant, because they're going to have different growing styles, different growing lengths, different times to maturity. And there's so many different, just shapes and sizes. And it all comes down to what you want to eat and what you want to grow. So the two biggest categories that we have for tomatoes are determinate versus indeterminate. I feel like most of us may be more familiar with growing indeterminate, but we may not know exactly what the difference is and how to treat those differently and the different challenges that come with each of them. So the first determinate are they're more bush-like, they're compact, they're typically pretty small, and they have a set growth cycle. They grow to, typically 3 to 4 feet, and then they stop growing. They produce all their fruit at once, and it's typically like a shorter harvest window. So these are ones that can be really good for if you're wanting to do a lot of canning. Maybe you make marinara or salsa or something like that, and you want to have that big harvest all at once and then, kind of be done with it. So some really popular varieties are like Aroma or the Rutgers. So those are that determinate. They're going to stay in that small bush. Once you get that harvest, you may have a couple smaller ones before or after, but then that's it. They're kind of done. And then the Indeterminate, I feel like that is really what most varieties are when you go to the nursery or when you're looking at seeds. So these are ones they continue to grow and produce fruit throughout the whole season until we get frost, or maybe you stop them, you cut them down, pull them out, but they will keep going and keep producing and having that harvest throughout the whole season. And the interesting thing about them is they are technically a vine. So they're not that bush structure. So they kind of need a lot more support. And there's a couple varying ways that you can kind of give them that support to maximize your growth and your space. But they do require a little bit more pruning to really direct that growth and to prevent your overcrowding and everything like that. So some examples, some of the really popular ones are your Early Girl, your Cherokee Purple, Brandywine, Beefsteak. Those are all Indeterminate. And I feel like pretty much most of the varieties that I see are going to be the Indeterminate. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is how to choose the variety that you want. In our climate, because we do have that shorter growing season, we have fluctuating temperatures, it can be ideal to focus on those varieties that are early maturing, that have cold tolerance, and that are smaller. Because if they're smaller, it takes less time, less nutrients and everything to get them to that ripe stage to harvest. So you can kind of get more fruit sooner. These are some popular ones in those categories. An early maturing is like your Early Girl, Celebrity. I feel like those are pretty popular. A really good cold tolerant is, we've got like the Glacier is really popular, or Siberian. I think Heirlooms are really fun, and that like the Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, those are some really good heirlooms. And then cherry are also really nice. I love growing cherry tomatoes. I feel like when I grow cherry tomatoes, I feel like I almost get more harvest out of them than bigger tomato varieties. Like just like wait over time, I feel like they just really just produce and produce, and they just do a great job. So like your Sweet 100, Sun Gold. I love the chocolate cherry ones, the more purple ones. I think those ones are just so fun. And throughout all of these, you can always find really nice varieties. And again, when it comes to choosing your variety, I would focus on how are you going to use it? Do you like a slicing tomato? Do you like the cherries? Pop them in salads? Just kind of what is going to be your end goal of how you're going to use them, and then you kind of work your way back there to really nail down what's the best variety for you to grow. Okay, I'm going to check real quick, see if we have anything. All right, and again, if you have any questions, always feel free to just drop it in the chat. I'll be coming back in, checking that chat periodically. Okay, so the next big section is actually growing our tomatoes. So I wanted to just touch on starting seeds indoors. At this point in time, like today, it could be considered maybe a little late to start your seeds indoors. If it's something you really want to do, you can always feel free to do it. I mean, you may be a little behind, but you can definitely always still try it. The advantages that you have to starting your own seeds is typically you kind of have more of a variety of the different varieties. So if there's a a very specific kind that you're looking for, it can sometimes be hard to find that in transplants, or maybe it's a really popular one. And, so you really are really focused on getting that variety, or sometimes people just maybe want to try it out for themselves and just kind of see how that goes. Obviously, seeds themselves are cheaper than buying transplants. So there's a couple, there's a couple different advantages if you want to start your seeds indoors. The biggest thing with starting your seeds indoors is going to be timing. You do need a good amount of time before that last frost in order to give them enough time to get to a good size to plant. So we say on average 6 to 8 weeks before that last frost. Again, that could vary depending on the individual variety that you are trying. And then the other biggest thing with starting seeds is just going to be that setup. You really want to make sure you're using a seed starting mix that is a sterile soil, because that's going to really help prevent some of the diseases that we encounter when we're starting seeds. The biggest one is dampening off. And then always just look at your seed packet. Normally it has a lot of really good information. It'll tell you about, how deep to plant it. And then it's kind of up to you if you want to use small containers, seed trays, and then you always want to make sure that they're getting enough light and heat, because again, tomatoes are a warm crop, so they are going to want that heat for germination. The other thing that I think about starting seeds indoors is just making sure that you have the space for them, because you may start them in a small little container and it only takes up this amount of space, but as they grow, you are going to want to be transplanting those up. And depending on when you can get them in the soil, like that, plant them in the ground, you may need to transplant them up a couple more times than you were anticipating, or you have other plans of putting them outside and having some protections on them. But that's just something that I think about when I'm starting seeds. It's not necessarily about the size that you have when you start them, but you got to think about how many do you want to end up with, and do you have the space set aside for 10 1-gallon pots of your tomatoes. So that's kind of what I think about when I'm starting seeds. And then the other thing, once they start to get their sets of their true leaves, like at least 2 sets, that's kind of when you want to move them into bigger containers. We're not using a sterile media anymore, and you're going to want to start fertilizing them. Once you kind of get to that point that you're getting ready to transplant, the temperatures are okay, or you have your temperature protections, you do not want to forget to harden them off, because they've been growing inside in your pretty controlled environment, and they're not used to being outside. So you do want to have a gradual exposure to the outdoor conditions over, you can do like a week to 2 weeks. And that just looks like every day putting them outside for a little bit longer each day. You can start with 1 to 2 hours, start them in a shady spot, and then over time, you're going to increase that by an hour or 2 and start increasing that sun exposure. And then, of course, always make sure you're protecting them from wind and keep an eye on the weather. I feel like that's something, especially in Utah, it varies so much day to day. Even if you have checked the weather and it was something, you may want to check it again, because I feel like it's just, sometimes it could be a little all over the place. Okay, so let me, okay, we do have a little question. We can address this right now. And this is something that's really good to think about when you are growing anything, is do things need a pollinator from another plant? So the thing with tomatoes is they don't necessarily need another plant to produce fruit. They do have both those flowers, the male and female, on the plant themselves. So they can pollinate themselves. But like with most things that can kind of pollinate themselves, you can have increased yields from having multiple plants. So just kind of something to keep in mind. You can get away with having just one, but sometimes you do see better yields when you have multiple plants somewhat close together, to just kind of help with that pollination. All right, let's talk about transplanting. So this is that big, the big time that we all wait for. I feel, most everybody around here kind of aims for Mother's Day. And the big thing that we're looking for is we want those nighttime temperatures to be very consistently above 50 degrees. When you're thinking about transplanting, it's all about making sure you have a good spot and that your soil is prepped. So tomatoes need at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun every day. So pick a really sunny spot. And then when you're thinking about that soil, we always want to make sure it's well draining, nutrient rich. You can add a compost or other aged manure to add in those nutrients. I love adding like an organic fertilizer or slow release tomato fertilizer. And then there's a couple other things you can add at the beginning to kind of help prevent some other issues down at the end. Excuse me. So some of those things are calcium nitrate or bone meal, and that's going to help with blossom end rot, which is kind of one of the bigger, more common issues that we see, that is a deficiency in that calcium. And kind of once you have blossom end rot, it's already showing that your soil shouldn't. Okay, sorry, I just have a little something stuck in my throat here. Okay. Once you're kind of noticing those issues, sometimes it can be a little late to correct. So I do have some examples that I'm going to talk about. I really like this GMB Organics. It's just a, tomato, herb, vegetable, and herb. It's 463. So this is the NPK. It's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are our major nutrients that we look at when we're doing a fertilizer. So I really like the organics one. These always contain, beneficial soil microbes. This one is really nice because it says it has some calcium and mycorrhizae. So you are adding in some of those already at the beginning. And the thing is, there's lots of options for fertilizer and amendments. So there's, just kind of take a look around. Always make sure you're reading the labels, because some things are going to be more of a fast release versus a slow release. So for your individual fertilizer or amendment, just make sure you read that label, because it'll normally give you guidelines for like how often to apply, how much to apply for your area, and everything like that. So yeah, I really like this one. An amendment could be like this calcium nitrate. It's calcium, so it's really going to help with that blossom end rot. And as you can see on the numbers, it's 1500, so it's really high in nitrogen. So that is definitely something you want to add at the beginning when you're planting. And then I also grabbed some Dynamite. This is just a really good, slow release fertilizer, really good for like all your vegetables. I really like this one. And then I just wanted to show some other examples of other things you can add for that calcium. Because like I said, there's a lot out there that you can use. So just, take a walk around, read some labels, because this is like a fish bone meal. And this is crab and lobster shell, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, there's so much out there that you could use. So just, see what you like best, see what's easiest, and yeah, we'll just go from there. Okay. All right, so we've chosen our spot, we've prepared our soil. The next thing is going to be actually digging those holes and planting them. So the interesting thing with tomatoes is that the little fine hairs on their stems, I mean, it's probably a little hard to see, but you know, tomato stems are like fuzzy. So those stems, if they are buried, they will actually turn into roots. Not every plant is like this, so don't do this with all your plants. But this is tomatoes specifically will do this. So when you're planting your tomatoes, what you want to do is you want to really dig like a pretty deep hole. And then I say, if I was planting this little guy, I would probably plant up to maybe like here, you know, here or here. So I would dig a really deep hole and I would, you know, prune off all of these leaves and then plant it right up to there to, you know, to where the next leaves are coming. And how that is going to benefit is this is going to turn into a very strong root system. It's going to have lots of roots, so will really be able to take up all that water, all the fertilizer, and it's just going to really produce some really nice tomatoes down at the end. Now, you may have also seen using a trench method. I think that one's really interesting. It literally, you're digging a trench and then you lay your tomato down, and it's the same thing of like you take off a lot of these leaves and you lay it down, and then you know at the end you kind of have it go up out of the soil, and you have your whatever support you're going to use, like a stake or a cage, anything like that. And then it's going to do that same thing of developing that strong root system right all down there in that soil. And then you'll have your little guy coming up. So there is a couple different methods you can do when planting tomatoes. But I think the biggest thing is just planting it deep, pruning off some of those leaves, and then your tomatoes will thank you for that. The other thing is, of course, spacing. That can vary based on your varieties, based on how you're growing them, like what kind of systems you are using for support. And I feel, you know, I always like to look at the tags. They're normally really good about putting some of that info in there. This one is an heirloom yellow pear. And yeah, just on the back of the tag, it says 24 to 36 inches apart. So you always want to make sure that you do have that adequate space in between, because that's going to, you know, really contribute to having good airflow. And I mean, really just making sure that your tomatoes have the space to grow. And something that I like to keep in mind as well is, like I said, how are you going to grow them? What kind of support are you going to use? And I like to be able to move around my tomatoes. So sometimes I like to give them a little more space, and then to just, you know, ensure that I can actually access them. Okay, I'm just gonna come. Okay, and then we have a question about watering. Watering is really important for tomatoes. And again, this is one of those things that proper watering is really going to help prevent a lot of the issues down the road that we see with tomatoes. With most things, we really want consistent, even, and deep watering. So that means I prefer a drip system because it's a slower watering. So it gives that time for that water to actually infiltrate down to those roots instead of like running off, taking your soil with you, or you just kind of do like a quick little drive by with the hose, and that's only really getting, you know, just the top couple inches, and we really want it to go down. So it can kind of vary with watering just depending on how you're watering. And this is one of those things I wish that there was just a set time I could tell everybody to water, but unfortunately, there is kind of a lot of factors that go into knowing how much you can water, because a lot of that is also going to be your soil and how fast your soil dries out, or maybe it retains a lot of moisture. And then again, it also depends on how you're delivering that water. Are you using a sprinkler system? Are you using drip tape? So I always say, you are going to want to do a little bit of kind of trial and error and just kind of check. If you're using a drip, there is, varying sizes of drip tapes and emitters as well. So that can, of course, play a role. So I would, run it for like a set amount of time, give it a couple, maybe like an hour or two to infiltrate, and then I would go and physically check your soil. Use your finger, go down at least a couple inches, see how wet or dry it is. And from there, you can kind of start to kind of figure out what your soil is going to want. And then the other thing is you also want to be keeping an eye on that temperature, because once the temperature starts going up, you're probably going to want to start increasing your watering time, because it's going to be, it's going to be evaporating that much faster. And then the other thing to keep in mind of timing is of watering is when you water. Because if you water at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it's already 100 degrees outside, that is not going to go as far as if you did that same watering at like 5 or 6 in the morning, because it's cooler. So it actually has time to like infiltrate down to those roots. So it's all going to be, pick your method, whatever is easier for you or whatever you have access to. And then, you're just going to have to, do a little trial and error, because it's going to depend on your particular soil. But of course, if you ever have any questions about, am I watering it too much or not enough, we are definitely always here to kind of help address some of those questions or concerns, to really help you dial it in on how you do your irrigation. So So here we go. Oh, I should have just gone to the next slide. Because here, yes, I was talking about watering and mulching. So yes, like a drip irrigation or a soaker hose is going to be really nice to get that slow flow so it infiltrates your soil. And another thing that can really help with your watering is going to be using a mulch, and like an organic mulch. So like straw, clippings, compost. You could even do like wood chips, because those are things that are going to help retain that moisture. And depending on what it is and how thick you do it, it can even help, prevent weeds, or sometimes just kind of prevent a little mess. Sometimes it's a little better to be walking on some wood chips than just the straight soil, and, can help with preventing compaction and all of that stuff. So lots of benefits to using a mulch. And I always do prefer an organic mulch, like a green mulch or something like that, as opposed to, some other options like a plastic or something like that. But always, if you find something that you like and it works for you, then keep on keeping on. Okay, so like I had alluded to when we were talking about our determinate or indeterminate varieties, there are a couple different ways that we can stake our tomatoes. Now remember, the indeterminate varieties are like a vine. So can be a little bit more challenging, but I find it best to, when you think of it as a vine as opposed to like a bush, I feel like that kind of can lead you into really finding a good method for your staking. And one of the biggest reasons why we want to stake is we want to keep that vine and that fruit off of the soil, because being on the soil, you're just going to get a lot more diseases. I mean, your fruit is going to be touching the soil. That's moisture. That can also be other critters and other insects, and just having that direct contact is just going to make the inevitable of you maybe losing some of your tomatoes. So it's really, you really want to have it up off the ground. Another reason is, personally for me, I like it when it's a little bit more organized. Because if you just kind of have them on the ground everywhere, it kind of get a little messy. And when you can give them some support, you're able to fit more in some spaces because you're giving them that space to grow. So some of the most popular ones are using a cage. You can also just use a stake or doing like a vertical trellis. Now, I'm a little bit more particular, or I side a little bit more with a vertical trellis than like a cage. And that's my personal experience when I've been growing tomatoes. But just some of the issues that I've run into when I'm using a cage can kind of be alleviated when using a trellis. I feel like with a trellis, there may be a little bit more of that setup at the beginning, but I feel like once you've kind of got that, it's really easy to do that vertical trellis. And I really like it because, again, I feel like you have more space to grow into. I feel like once your tomato kind of gets to the top of your cage, I mean, that's its support. Where else is it going to go? With a vertical trellis, you've got as high as you make it. And I just think it looks cool, to be honest. I like using our vertical space. I think it's really fun. And especially if you do have a smaller space to work with, I feel like you could really get away with putting your tomatoes closer in a vertical trellis because they're not spreading out as much. You can keep them much more tight and still have really good airflow, really good disease prevention and everything like that. But again, always do what works best for you. If you have some cages that you really like, don't let me dissuade you in using them. Cages are really great. And I mean, any way that is just getting them off the ground is a win. So I feel like sometimes it's also like, hey, what supplies do you have laying around at your house? Like, see what, if you've got some stuff that you can use, I'm all about that. And just kind of whatever works for your individual space is going to be fantastic. Now, the other thing that I touched on is some of that temperature protection, because again, our climate can be a little variable. Now I'm going to grab some things down here. So one of the problems that we run into is at the beginning of the season, we want to get those tomatoes in the ground because we want them to start growing. Now remember, that time to maturity is once it's transplanted. So the sooner they're in the ground, the sooner that you would potentially be able to, get your actual harvest. But again, the thing to keep in mind is going to be those nighttime temperatures. Now, I've got a couple examples of like things you can use to help protect them if we are going to have some lower temperatures, if you are trying to transplant them out earlier. So this is it's called a hot cap. It's just kind of like a waxed paper. This one's really great. You just kind of like pop it over that individual plant. And again, I've also seen people make a hot cap out of materials that they have. I really like milk gallons, and people will like cut off the bottom. And the thing that is interesting about that is then you can unscrew the top for some ventilation. So again, this is like the concept, and you can do with that however you want. And then the other one that I see that's pretty popular is going to be, those walls of water. This is something that you fill up with that water throughout the day. It traps some of that heat, and then it can release that overnight. And that's really going to help protect those as well. And then, of course, if you've got your tomatoes in like a nice row, you can always be using just like a frost cloth, and that can definitely help that as well. So that's when our temperatures drop below 45 to 50 degrees. The other thing to keep in mind is when we get to the other end of our extreme and we're getting super hot temperatures above 95 degrees. It can still be prudent to use some temperature protection in that time, because when it gets that hot, it can affect your flowering and your fruiting. So it can be really, really good to use just like a shade cloth, set that up over your row, and then that can help regulate those temperatures so it's not getting so hot that you're going to have other issues of flowering and fruit set and other things like that. So I'm just gonna check back here. Oh, okay, so we've got a question about using an Ola for watering tomatoes. I love that question. I think Olas are really cool. If you're not familiar with what an Ola is, it's like a big terracotta vase. And what you do is you actually bury that in your garden bed or your garden row. And it's not glazed or anything. So the water is able to slowly seep out of that Ola, and then it's directly at the root level of your tomatoes, or whatever's in your garden bed. And it's slow, it's directed, and yeah, so I love an Ola. I think they're really great. I love that we're using them more. They do have a really rich history that I think is really interesting, and I think it's really fun to kind of look into that stuff. So if you've got one, or if you are interested in one, I say go for it. Go ahead and try it. The only thing that I would say to keep in mind is just being aware of how big it is and where it is that you plant it. Because I've seen them sometimes where they're shaped like here's the top and then it goes out really wide. So I would more just want to keep that in mind of when you're working in the bed, of not accidentally stabbing it with a shovel or something like that. I just, would just be mindful of not breaking it while you are working that soil. But other than that, I think that they're excellent tools, and it's really leaning into that, passive watering. And yeah, I think they're super, super great. So yeah, I'd love to do more experimenting of using them. I think they're awesome. Okay. All right, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but we're going to go delve a little bit deeper into some fertilizing. So the biggest thing, you can use like different fertilizers throughout the growing season, or you can, if you find a fertilizer that you like, that can be good throughout the beginning and the middle, that is great too. The biggest thing is at the beginning, when you're planting it, you would want it to be a balanced fertilizer. And then if you were wanting to switch to a different fertilizer, you would want to focus on one that's going to be high in phosphorus. That's going to be that middle number there, because phosphorus is what is going to encourage that fruiting. So I always like to apply, I love applying like a balanced fertilizer at the beginning while you're preparing that soil or in the planting hole. Like this would be something that I would kind of consider like that balanced fertilizer. Also, like the G&B Organics all-purpose, you can see here that those numbers are 444. So it's an even across the board. And then you could always switch to like this Gardener Special is 11, 15, 11. So that's going to be higher in phosphorus. So in that, when you would want to switch would kind of just depend on just what your plant is doing. When you kind of start to see those flowers appear is when you're going to want to try to give it some more of that phosphorus to help out those flowers. And something that I found a little interesting is if you can find like a really good fertilizer that has good micronutrients in it. So that the NPK, those three numbers, those are our macronutrients. And so that's what our plant needs the most of. That can kind of be what's considered the most important when we're talking about fertilizing. But with tomatoes and I feel like vegetables in general, those micronutrients can really help improve that flavor in there. So again, I always love, like the GMB organics are really nice. The Fertilome ones are really nice. Those are ones that we sell here. But of course, always just read your labels. It will have those breakdowns of your macro and micronutrients. And if you want to switch them, keep an eye on your plant. Or you can kind of use something like this tomato, vegetable, and herb. And you could just use that the whole time. It's kind of up to you, what you like, what you prefer. And then again, I'm going to bring up the calcium nitrate again. Calcium is really, really great for tomatoes. And I feel like something that I didn't bring up earlier when I was talking about preparing your beds, I feel like, especially if you've been maybe noticing some issues with your vegetables, or maybe if it's a new space, it's always a good idea to get a soil test. You can go through USU, and they've got, that's like the biggest soil lab that's near us, I believe. And what's really great is you can tell them what you're using it for. Like, it is a vegetable bed. It's really nice. They'll give you all the breakdown of your soil, tell you your soil texture, and if you are low on any of the nutrients, and they can kind of give you some guidance on amendments to use. So that can be just something to keep in mind if you've been having some issues year to year, or maybe if it's a new space, you just moved, anything like that. I think a soil test is a really great resource to use when you're doing your planning. All right, so I want to talk about pruning a little bit. When we're doing our indeterminate varieties, we do want to try to control growth, and especially, if you're doing like a vertical or even a cage, to kind of help not get them so overgrown, we're going to want to prune out the suckers. So how to identify them, you can kind of see when they're in the corner of those leaf axils, that's what the suckers are. And I think this is a really great example, if you can see this here. So you see here is a flower cluster. You can kind of see those flowers kind of start to form. But right in here, this is a sucker. So this is something I would go and prune off. And, when they're really small like this, if you can kind of see that there, they can be a little hard to get off, mainly just because you don't want to damage the plant. So sometimes people will let them get a little bigger and then go ahead and prune that out. Because if you don't, that's just going to take off into a whole nother plant. And we really want to try to keep it to, I prefer to try to keep it to a single leader, because then I'm directing that growth to more, I'm trying to get a harvest, I'm not trying to grow some leaves. So when you can kind of keep it to that central leader, then it kind of helps down the road when we're talking about harvest and everything like that. So let me just check back here. Oh, okay. So I'm going to talk about this question we've got really quick. Do eggshells really work for adding calcium? I feel like that's one of those things that it's like, yes and no. I think the thing with eggshells is it's just going to be the time that it takes to break down in your soil. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure if it is a faster breakdown or not. But I've even in past farms that I've worked at, I worked at a farm that we had like a cultural kitchen and would have other cookings. So there would be like clam/oyster bakes, and it would be something that at the end we would take those shells and like break them and put them in like a soil pile to break down, and that's something that we would add back in to that soil. So again, I think it's just kind of one of those things that it's just going to be a time kind of factor that goes into how much that is actually going to be adding calcium to your plants right now. So I would, if you want to go that route, I personally would not add those directly to like a planting hole, I would maybe put them in, if you have a compost pile or just a soil pile, kind of add those in there, let them break down, and maybe you can use that soil like the next season or something like that. That's probably what I. Okay, now we're into the fun part of harvesting and storage. Now, when you're harvesting, there can be a couple different stages you can harvest them at, and that for me would just kind of be, again, what are you using for? You can harvest when they're at this blush or breaker stage, when they're just barely starting to get some color, and that can be nice, maybe you're traveling or giving them to friends, or a lot of like production growers pick more at that breaker stage so that they have time to continue to ripen, so that when it kind of gets to that end person, that they're at that ripe stage. If you are picking a tomato for your salad tonight, I would go a little bit more on, you're looking for a really full color and you want them to be a little soft, like not super hard. You can always harvest those green tomatoes, because that's something at the end of the season when you're kind of like, before that frost, if we're deciding that we're done, you can go ahead and harvest those green tomatoes. If you want to ripen them, you can always ripen them on the counter, put them in a paper bag, that will help ripen it faster. And then the other thing, when you are harvesting, just kind of avoid like just yanking at the plant. You don't want to damage any of those branches. You can kind of, I like to harvest like a little cluster if I can, and I'll normally, oh no. Oh no. Okay, here we go. That was my bad. You can kind of, I prefer to take a pruner and kind of cut off that whole little cluster, and then I'm not damaging anything unnecessarily. When we're storing them, we don't want to put tomatoes in the fridge. I kind of remember, it's like when I go to the grocery store, they're always out. So putting them in the fridge is going to reduce that flavor. And something I was taught is also, when you are placing them on a surface, don't place them with the fruit down. Flip them so that the stem is down, because then that's going to reduce some of that pressure that's on the fruit, and then you won't get like one of those little flat spots. So that's just a little fun little thing I learned. And then, yeah, if you want to, I like to kind of, if they were picked on the vine, I've got that cluster, and I like to keep them on that vine until I'm ready to use them. Oh, now I'm going the wrong way. Okay, here we go. Okay, let me check questions. Okay, hold on. You can blend eggshells in a blender with an acid like vinegar. Ooh, that's really interesting. I like that. Utah soils generally have a lot of calcium, just needs to be bioavailable. That is so interesting. Yes, I love that. That's like a fun, yeah. Because yeah, like that's it. You're breaking it down for itself. I'm sorry, that sounded weird. But yeah, you're doing the breaking down, and you're not having to wait. So I really like that. Yeah, like if you want to use those eggshells now, blend it up. I love that. Okay. My grandpa Glover always said nothing tastes as good as a tomato you've grown yourself. Yes, I totally agree. I love, farmers market tomatoes are great, but I just think your own off the vine, I think there's nothing. Okay, I'm gonna go over some pests and diseases. We've got about 12-ish minutes left. So I want to see if we try to have a little time at the end for some questions if we do, or just some general discussions. And so, yeah. Okay, so these are the big common pests. We've got aphids, we've got those tomato hornworms, and spider mites. With aphids, I feel like, the easiest ways to go are like a neem oil, insecticidal soap, maybe like a horticulture oil, or you can do a strong spray with the hose. Things to keep in mind when you're using an oil, always keep an eye on the temperature. Read the bottle. Sometimes it'll say don't use above a certain temperature, just because that can kind of dampen like transpiration, and then you're putting an oil on something that's in the sun. So that can kind of cause some burning. You're just increasing the light. It's like taking a magnifying glass onto that leaf. So when you're using an oil in general, I would just kind of keep an eye on the temperature. Now, tomato hornworms. These ones can be, how you want to treat them is entirely up to you and what's best for you. They do turn into like kind of a pretty moth. And there is something to talk about with just like beneficials, or just kind of creating an ecosystem with other insects and stuff. So however you want to use it, if you are trying to be more organic and not use chemicals, you can definitely hand pick them. I have even done a lot of, I call it like trap cropping, where I essentially have a sacrificial crop, and I let that be attacked by other pests, and then typically, it's like, hey, go use that one, and I'm going to save these ones for myself. So there's a lot of different methods that you can do. But yeah, when you see these, it's these guys in the middle. I think they look funky. They're also like really big, so I think they're really interesting. You can use BT for like a chemical to treat them if you do want. And then for spider mites, again, you can also use like a neem oil, permethrin, things like that would be great. Hummingbird or finks moths are really cool and help with pollination. Yes, I love that. See, there is a lot of other pollinators besides just bees, and even specifically honeybees. There's, bats pollinate, beetles, moths, hummingbirds. Sometimes just because it's not what we identify as the prettiest, doesn't mean they don't have a role to play. And so, yeah, I think moths are fun. Can be your own personal preference, but I think there is something to, kind of letting the ecosystem, there is like, other beneficials you can release and things like that. So yeah, I think it's worth kind of looking into some of that, and not just, just trying to get rid of them, like with like a chemical right off the bat. Okay, some diseases. We've talked a lot about the blossom end rot, mainly caused by that calcium deficiency or fluctuations with soil moisture. So again, adding calcium, ensuring consistent, even watering. Another one that's pretty common is going to be powdery mildew. That is going to improve when you've got better air circulation. So that's kind of another reason why when I've done vertical, I really like that, because there's lots of air circulation around that plant. And then the other thing is, if you can avoid that overhead watering. Powdery mildew is a fungus, and fungus is very easily spread by water. So if you're watering overhead, those droplets are going to splash on the leaves. That's going to spread the spores and just keep continuing the cycle. So that's another reason why drip is really nice, or just getting right at those roots. Another one that is semi-common, I think it kind of depends where you live, is curly top. This is kind of a picture of it down here. This is actually a virus that is transmitted by the beet leafhopper. So unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to control the curly top, like the virus. We have to try to control that leafhopper. So there's a couple different things you can use, like as soon as those are seen. And that's one of those things. If it gets it, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do. Sometimes you may just have to terminate that plant, and note for next year that you've got those beet leafhoppers in the area, and kind of plan for that. Okay, this is kind of a lot, but there's just some general common problems that we encounter. I feel like I get, bursting and growth cracks a lot. That's from irregular watering. Because again, I mean, tomatoes are full of water. So if you suddenly increase how much water you are giving it, it's going to take all that in and it doesn't really have anywhere to go. So that's going to cause that fruit to kind of crack like that. If you're having that high leafy growth, but not a lot of flower, you can have too much nitrogen. So that can kind of be a sign to use that high phosphorus fertilizer. There actually is, here we go. I like Fertilizing. They've got a lot of these really nice sprays. This is called Tomato and Pepper Set. This is a spray that you can use, and it just helps increase yield. It kind of helps like develop more flowers. So if you're having that issue and you're trying everything else, this can maybe be something to kind of add into the mix because it is a spray, so it's more fast acting. Or I may have, yeah. Okay, and then another thing that can be used as well is going to be that like yield booster. This can help stop that blossom end rot. This would be something that you would, again, it's a spray. So like I said, it's kind of showing that you already have that deficiency in the soil. So if you are noticing that blossom end rot, this is going to be like a fast action thing that you can use on there. Okay, poor fruit set. We talked about those fluctuating temperatures, dry soil, not enough sun, too much nitrogen. So those are some kind of just general cultural things you can do to adjust your environment to help encourage that flowering and fruiting. And then again, you can always, if you're trying everything and it's still not working, or if you want to just experiment, I love, that tomato and pepper set can also really help encourage that flowering and hopefully get those fruits. And then another thing could also potentially be pollination. Maybe you don't have enough pollinators in the area, so you can always plant more pollinator plants that'll encourage them to come in, flowers, anything like that to kind of help encourage those pollinators to come visit. And I have also seen people use like a vibrating toothbrush to kind of stimulate the stem. And then, once you've got your flowers, you're kind of shaking it like this, and then hopefully your pollen will fall off of the flower, make its way to another flower, and give you some good pollination. The last one that I have kind of seen a lot is going to be tomato leaf roll. That's just where like your older leaves, it's just what it says. They roll up. So the margins will touch or overlap. The leaves feel leathery, but like they're still green and nothing else really looks wrong. This is just temporary from really wet soil. So this would be kind of something that you would see that and be like, oh, I think maybe I'm watering a little bit too much. So then you could go and adjust your watering. And as that soil dries, your symptoms naturally disappear. Oh, here, let me check this. I've seen the hornworms seem to only eat what is necessary to reach the stage in which they go into the ground and form their chrysalis. Yeah, like that, I like that too. That can be something of, we're just trying to support them through that stage. And yeah, I mean, is one or two going to really damage your plant that much? Kind of understanding that, we're also out in nature too, and they're going to be there. So yeah, I really like that of, understanding they're going to take a little bit and then they're going to go into their life. Okay, so I think that's all I've got for the problems. That's everything I've got for you today, guys. So, we do have a couple minutes. I'll stick around in case we do have any questions or if we want to talk about anything. I love little chit chats. But again, if you have any ongoing issues, anything that you're concerned about, our diagnostics team is always available to help. You can send us an email. You can take pictures, send us an email. It's diagnostics right down here at gloverNursery.com. You can always come on in. It's really great if you have a picture or even like a sample of something that is going on, and they are very knowledgeable about kind of figuring out what is going on and what to do to help address those issues. So yes, we are here to help and just kind of also help you learn what resources are available. And yeah, I mean, that's it. I'll stick around for a couple minutes. And let's see here. Are you aware of tomato varieties that do especially well in Utah that also taste really good? Ooh, I think I really like, in general, like heirloom tomatoes or cherry tomatoes. And from my understanding, I mean, I think most of the varieties do really well here. Let me see if let me ask one of my colleagues. Okay, so yeah, I think like, Cherokee Purple, Brandywine, and Black Crim are going to be really good for like flavor and color. And then let's see if the San Marzano is a really good one as well. I think if you're going for like interesting, flavorful, I really like an heirloom variety. And I mean, you can get really cool colors and shapes out of those ones. And then again, I really like cherry tomatoes because I feel like you can just get some really good flavor from them, and they mature quicker. You can get more out of them. So yeah, those are some of my personal favorites. In general, tomatoes do really well in Utah. The thing is just managing our short season. So yeah, and I know we do have a good amount of tomato starts in the nursery already. And from this week moving forward, I believe we're getting shipments 3 to 4 times a week just of tomatoes. So we will be getting in a lot of starts, a lot of different tomatoes. We have all the different, categories, from like larger to cherry to heirloom, and everything in between. So if you always want to come down, kind of take a look at the different varieties that we have. I think I was looking in there a little earlier, and there's a lot of good ones, because I think, what did I grab? I grabbed the yellow pear, which I think those ones are really good. Oh yeah, and this is Celebrity, which is a really good like slicing tomato. And I think Celebrity is really, really good. It's really popular because I think it does well. It's kind of like one of those early maturing ones. And I think it's a great variety. So yeah, thank you so much for your questions and participations. Do we have any other final questions that I can help out with? I'll just hang out for a couple minutes. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming to our live stream during the spring and kind of into summer. We are going to be focusing more on some live streams rather than in-person classes. So keep an eye out for our upcoming ones, and we'll be here throughout the whole season. And I'm so looking forward to spring and summer this year. I think it's going to be really great. So yeah, I'm gonna hop off. But again, if you any other lingering questions, or if anything comes up, just feel free to contact or come in and see our diagnostics table. All right, bye guys. Thank you so much.